Hello, everybody. Guess what? We are doing an impromptu episode today. This is our friend Lucy. You're listening to the VBAC Link, and we can't wait to hear her story. We're going to talk about big babies. We hear it all the time. Big babies. I can't have vaginal birth because I had big babies, or my pelvis is too small. But she is here to share her story with you today and let you know big babies can come out of vaginas. That is this big statement today. Big babies can come out of vaginas. I'm going to hurry and read a review, and then we will jump into her story. This is from BJMG 104 on Apple Podcasts, and it says, this podcast is empowering and positive. As a home birth transfer turned cesarean, this podcast has been so instrumental in helping me shed the shame and sense of failure I have been feeling since my son's birth. Armed with the knowledge gained in this podcast, I now feel more confident than ever in my next pregnancy. VBAC is possible for me. Thank you for this podcast. Well, thank you, BJMG 104, for sharing your review.
You are tuned into the VBAC Link podcast with Megan Heaton, who is a longtime doula and VBAC mom herself, here to help you get inspired for birth after having had a C-section. Along with this podcast, the VBAC Link offers blogs, resources, and a comprehensive VBAC course for both parents preparing for birth and doulas wanting to take their VBAC education to the next level. Be sure to follow Megan and her team on all social media platforms for even more. Although these podcast episodes are VBAC specific, it is encouraged for all expectant moms to listen and educate themselves on how to avoid a C-section from the get-go. The purpose of this podcast is to educate and inform. It is not meant to replace advice from any other qualified medical professional. Here is your host, Megan.
Okay, Lucy, we're jumping right in. I'm going to turn the time over so you can have all the time to share your story about big babies. Tell us about it. Tell us your experience.
Oh my goodness. I see all the time, big babies. And from 18 weeks pregnant, the second pregnancy now, I was told all the time, they would measure my belly and they would say, he's measuring 2 weeks ahead. He's measuring 2 weeks ahead. And, just part of me was like, well, hopefully he's big, like one of his Uncle Nicks, because I have an Uncle Nick, my brother-in-law, and an Uncle Nick, my brother. And I was like, maybe he'll just be a big dude. It's okay. My mom had 10-pound baby. So I was like, I think we'll be okay. But obviously I was really, really hopeful for my VBAC. And I left my previous practice after my first birth because my first birth was something that was just really, really traumatic to me. And it didn't go at all the way that I had planned. And it really came down to me just even talking to myself and my husband and us looking at ourselves and saying, being educated is just such a big thing. And so I remember from the day that I found out I got pregnant, I would go on walks every day with my daughter and I would listen to the VBAC Link. And I was like, these women know what the deal is. They are educated and they understand what's going on and they're empowering themselves. And I was like, I've heard so much about doulas and I didn't really know if a doula would be for me. And I talked to a couple of different companies and I found Aussie Doula here in Charlotte. And I spoke to Helen and she said, you have to meet Raquel. She's my VBAC queen. And I was just totally just swept away after meeting Raquel. And my husband and I joke because, Raquel has that spiritual vibe to it where she really centered me, but then she also had a voice for me. So from the beginning, Raquel helped me make those decisions and stand up for myself from those appointments where maybe you don't want a cervical check right in the beginning because anything can happen. And that's kind of what I'm going to share. And I don't know if I need to touch it all on my first experience with my firstborn. But having a big baby, totally there. So with my first, I was pregnant. I had a really healthy pregnancy, not one issue whatsoever. I mean, I was the girl that people didn't really want to talk to. When you asked me how my pregnancy was, I was like, it's rainbows and butterflies. That's how it is. It's great. And people were like, oh, not even morning sickness. And I was like, literally nothing. So I was told I had a macrosomic baby and I really trusted my doctor. I'd been with that practice for 5 years. And he's like, listen, if you don't do an induction, you're basically asking for a C-section. I didn't know who to ask. I wasn't on these different groups online. And so I just trusted. So at 39 weeks and 2 days, I went in on a Thursday and I got induced with Cervidil and Cytotec for 2 days. And I was completely zero dilated. Nothing was happening. Saturday, they hit me with Pitocin. Within about 30 minutes, my water exploded. And so I still wasn't dilated. So then I got an epidural at like 6 centimeters, and then I just plateaued. But during that time, I got a fever, an amniotic fluid infection. Everything that could go wrong was going wrong. And I remember from the first night on Thursday, the doctor walked in and he said, we don't have to do this. He goes, you could just have a C-section and you don't have to go through this pain. And at the time I kind of laughed it off, but in hindsight, I was like, he was so not supportive. And that should have been my red flag from that moment.
Yeah.
But I just really trusted the process. He was someone at the practice I didn't know and I had never met. Turned out he was the guy who did my C-section on Sunday. And so that Sunday when I had my C-section, I started to feel a lot of things and a lot of pressure down there. And I don't really do great medically when it comes to, everything grosses me out. So towards the end of my C-section, I was kind of hollering. Josephine came out, my daughter, and she wasn't really crying or doing anything. And, that's another sign to me that she wasn't ready. She didn't have her full time to just be ready and do what she needed to do and my body to do for her to, have the birth that also she deserved. So I was closed up in a way that really wasn't grand to me. I had internal staples and outside I had only glue. And I say this because I've empowered so many of my friends already to just know, how are you closed up in that case that maybe you do have a C-section? It's something that maybe many of us don't talk about or think about because we're like, well, a C-section won't happen to me. Well, after a 3-day failed induction, you could only imagine how swollen I was. So by the time we got home on Tuesday, I coughed my incision open, my top layer, and ended up back in the ER.
Oh.
And so
man.
It was awful. So when I got home Tuesday, Thursday, that happened. So in the hospital, they cite me for COVID. I'm COVID positive. So now I'm like, well, the world's ending, surely. So then I have an infection in my uterus. I need antibiotics. They want to admit me for 3 days. And I'm just like, I can't. Like, if you want to put a woman into postpartum depression who's surviving it and getting through it, take her away from her baby for 3 days and put her in the hospital. I was like, I can't physically do that, not mentally. I was like, I just had this sweet little girl that I want to be next to. I want to, have my moments with her and my husband. So I was like, there's just no way. So thankfully enough, I was given some antibiotics, but I did have to drive all the way to Uptown, which is 30 minutes from where I live in Fort Mill, South Carolina, and have my incision packed every 2 days. By the doctors because I needed to close up. It was just such a nightmare. And, for 5 good weeks, I looked at my husband and I was like, well, maybe we're only child kind of people. And, we come from big Greek and Italian background families. And I always thought I'd wanted 4 kids. And I was like, I just don't think I could ever go through that again. So the time passed and like all women, we forget our trauma. So then the time came where we were like, let's add to the mix. I'm more educated. I've been reading a lot on this. Things are possible. Just because I had a C-section doesn't mean that I am now, married to that. And, I have family that still lives in Greece. And even my aunt was like, well, now that you had that, that's all you can ever have. And I was like, no, that's not true. I was like, and I'm going to show the world that that's not true. So when I got pregnant, I looked for a practice that was supportive. And I went on the VBAC Link and I just on Facebook and I read about, different doctors. And I went to this one practice in Charlotte. And around my 18-week appointment, I was told that at 40 weeks to the day that I'd have a C-section. And I asked why. And he said, that's what we do with all women. And I said, well, I'm not all women. My name's Lucy, and I have a unique, history of medical history, and I'm me in my own pregnancy. And he said, that's just not the risk that the practice takes. And I said, well, I've heard that Pitocin's safe. A Foley bulb if necessary. There's other mechanisms and different things that we could do. And he said, that's just not something that we're willing to do. And I said, well, going back to our first visit and our other conversations, you're not VBAC supportive then. You're barely VBAC tolerant. So he said to me, well, I'll give you my suggestion. And then worst case scenario, you just don't come to the hospital. And I said, well, I'm not here for that worst case scenario. I'm here to fully entrust in my doctors and my provider. I said, so that's just not the option that I'm looking for. And he responded with, well, if we're going to part ways, better sooner than later. So that was my hint. I came home and looked at my husband and I said, the one appointment you didn't come to, I was like, everything hit the fan. I was like, no way. So I reached out to my old doctor, Dr. Graham, who had left the OB part of, the practice and stuff. And she had went on her own to a different firm or a different practice. And I said, who do you recommend? And she said to me, there's a great doctor at Mintview OBGYN. His name is Dr. Gibbons. So me and my husband made an appointment and we went out there and we spoke with him. And from the first second that I sat there, he said, macrosoma, baby, why is this on your chart? She was 8 pounds, 4 ounces. He said, this is irrelevant. He said, there's no medical reason that you had a C-section. And I said to him, thank you. That's exactly what I'm saying. I said, I'm just here for a fair chance. And, he talked to me and he said, if it does end up in a C-section, I don't want you to think that you failed. And I said to him, by no means, if that's what the ending happens and I have a healthy baby and a healthy mama, that's not how I'm going to feel. I said, however, I do want the full experience, the full opportunity to be able to have a trial of labor, and achieve my VBAC. So, from there on, that every time we met, we talked about, he would talk about the size, but he never told me that the size meant that I needed to get that baby out. So as things kind of progressed in my pregnancy, I would hear a lot that he was large, and around 40 weeks, I had an ultrasound. Well, I had one at 36 and they said he was big. And then I had one right at 40 weeks to the day, which was like 2 Thursdays ago. And the ultrasound tech, she was the sweetest. I love seeing her at this one location, and she measured him and he measured 97 percentile. Then she did one whole measure all over again, everything. And she goes, I'm getting the same exact number. She's like, I just feel so confident that he's 97%. And I said, okay, great. Thank you. She said, he looks healthy. Amniotic fluid's healthy. I was like, great. So then on Friday, I went into the doctor. And so I guess earlier that week on Monday, I decided that I would have a membrane sweep, but I was only 1 centimeter dilated, but I was 50% effaced. And I didn't really know if, doing that was for me. And I hadn't had one check my entire pregnancy. And every time I said no, it was a question when I went to the doctor. It was, would you like to be checked? And I said, no, thank you. And then that was the end of the conversation, which was perfect to me. And I will stop and just say, one day I was having some pains. I want to say I was like early 30 weeks pregnant. And I went to an urgent care OB here in Charlotte. And it just so happened my doula was in the area. So she went with me. And when I got there, I was having some pains. That's why I went. And the nurse practitioner opened the door and she said, go ahead and undress from the waist down. We're doing a cervical check. You're in labor. And as she closed the door, my doula went, is that what you like? And the lady opened the door and just looked at me. And I said, no, that's not what I'd like. I said, quite frankly, you don't even know the color of my hair. How would you even know that I'm in labor? I said, what I'd like is for you to come in and have a conversation with me. And if we feel the need to do something, we'll be on the same page. She goes, well, I'm going to have to mark your chart. She goes, that you declined it. And I said to her, man, you do what you got to do. At this point, I said, but I would appreciate if you could come in and maybe you could feel my belly and we could just talk through it. And she just had the worst attitude the whole time. And then when the ultrasound tech came in, she did a scan and she was so sweet and was showing me the baby. And she's like, look, everything looks great here and blah, blah, blah. And I was just so thankful that she kind of brought me back down. But, I'm not one to leave a review, but I made sure I was like, I need the world to know that if you're going to come here, you're going to have a voice and then I realized there was a theme at that urgent care that you really didn't have a voice when you went in. So I was so thankful that Raquel was with me, my doula, to help me have that first experience of just standing up for what I wanted in my birth plan and in my pregnancy. So that's why I thought it was such a big deal when I would go to a Mintview OBGYN, that it was just a question of, would you like this? So around 39 weeks is when I had my first sweep, 39 and a few days. Then I had that ultrasound, and then I saw Dr. Gibbons on Friday prior to going into labor. And at that point, I was 1.5 centimeters, and he did a sweep. And I had actually lost a lot of my mucus plug during that sweep. And he just said to me, he said, well, the goal is to go into labor naturally, and that's what we're going to keep saying. And that was really it. He didn't tell me my baby was big or I needed to get him out or anything. And then that night, I started having contractions all night, like every 8 minutes for hours. And then the next day they were gone. And I was like, oh no, is that not real? Like, what's going to happen now? And, of course, as later you get in your pregnancy, you're like, I really want to go into labor. Is this going to happen for me? So on Sunday, I was 40 weeks and 3 days. And so at around 6 o'clock, contractions started happening again, every 10 minutes. And so I hung out on my yoga ball and walked around. We went on a walk around the neighborhood. And then around 9 p.m., I was like, okay, it's time to lay down, relax. I laid in bed and they kept getting closer and closer and closer, but they were still more than 5 minutes apart. And then at around 12:25 a.m., I felt a pop and I was like, that's gotta be my water. And so I stood up, and sure enough, it was my water. And so I called Raquel, and she said, I'm going to come by the house first, because the goal was not to get to the hospital too early as well. And although I had trust in this, trust in the process and the doctors, I was still really nervous that someone would try to like force an epidural on me, or even just the catheter in case I needed a C-section. So we were trying to really get to the hospital at the right time. So I started to get ready though, and Raquel was on her way to my house, and my husband was packing the car, and something didn't feel right. I felt a little bit of extra pain, and I'm very high pain tolerant. And I called Raquel and I said, I just want to go to the hospital. My contractions at that point were 5 minutes apart. And she said, absolutely. She had just pulled up to the house. So we left, went to the hospital, and we got there. The nurse came in and triage, and she checked me, and then she didn't say anything. And I said, well, good news. How dilated am I? And she looked at me in kind of like a sad little voice, and she said, have you ever been checked? I said, yeah, I was checked on Friday. I'm 1.5. She said, you're still 1.5. And I was like, oh no. She goes, and that was your water, and your baby has meconium. And the monitors were reading really high heart rate for him. So all of a sudden my world just crashed down, and I was like, that's it. This is it. I'm going to have a C-section. And Raquel looked at me, and it makes me all sad, and I just want to cry as we talk about it. But Raquel looked at me and she said, it's a marathon, and it takes time. And she goes, you have to remember to, release and allow your body to do what it needs to do and surrender. She goes, the beginning is going to be slow. It's going to happen so fast once it gets going. She goes, you're not going to have expected it. And I believed in that moment that, Raquel was, telling me exactly what I needed to hear and know for my body. So, we hung out in triage for maybe an hour. And by the time we got to a room, I was 3.5. And I was like, okay, progress. And about 30 minutes later, I was 6 centimeters. And I was like, okay. So we got to the hospital at 1:45 at night. And so by 4:45 a.m., I was 8.5. I was 8 centimeters dilated. And Raquel had been constantly moving me. She would not let me stay in one position. And I was just like, is this really happening? Everything's happening so fast. These contractions are so hardcore. But one thing that she recommended for me was nitrous, because we were trying to stay away from the epidural, at least in the beginning. And at that point, I was begging for it. And she said, if you make it to 5, she goes, we'll get an epidural. She goes, but just try the nitrous for me. And I tried the nitrous, and while it didn't remove the pain, it kind of like takes the edge off. I don't know if you've heard of other women using it, but I will say it was definitely a great tool to have in your belt, like in the delivery room.
I used it as well.
Yeah, I had no clue. Great. Yeah, if Raquel wouldn't have told me, I would have had no idea. So by that point, when I got to 8 centimeters, Raquel was like, listen, she goes, we got this. She goes, I'm going to have you get up, and you're going to sit on the yoga ball, and we're just going to keep moving. And I was still asking for the epidural. And she said, can you try and ask me for the epidural when you're not in the middle of a contraction so I can believe you? And I was like, that's not fair. So the nurse comes over, and she hangs a bag of liquids, and she says to me, when this bag is finished, I'll get you an epidural. I said, y'all are so setting me up right now. I was like, there's no way I'm going to have time to get an epidural. I was like, everybody's just totally like looking at each other and not looking at me like she ain't not getting an epidural. So by the time I got up and sat on the yoga ball, I was like, oh my God, I have to push. So they get me right back on the bed, and they check me, and I'm 10 centimeters dilated, but he's not perfectly face down. He's like not all the way sunny side up, but he's not all the way down either. So I'm really like, Raquel manhandled me. She totally like flipped me on my side. It was like spinning babies to the max in the middle of contractions that are happening every couple of seconds. And I just, relaxed into what she was doing. It was like the flying cowgirl, and he just flipped right back to where he needed to be, perfect position. And I pushed for an hour. So at 5 a.m., I started pushing. By 6:06, he was here. And I just can't say enough, for a hospital that I went to and didn't have a great experience in my first, I had the most phenomenal, just redemption birth that I could have dreamed of. The nurses, even the NICU team that was in there just in case. The doctor from the practice I had never met, Dr. Rogers, at the end of my bed for the entire hour I pushed, stretching me, helping me. I mean, to the point where I only have a midline of vaginal tear, where I didn't tear any other way, with a 10-pound, 2-ounce baby. And it's just like so unreal to me that, you're told all the time, big babies, can't get them out. I've been reading these posts online for days since I had my little one on the 18th of the month. And I feel the need every single time a woman posts in distress that I just need to respond and be like, you have this.
You're 18th of this month?
I just had him.
Like not even 10 days ago?
Not at all. No.
Oh my gosh.
So fresh. And I feel like that's why I'm still in all my feels about it. But I looked at Raquel, and I don't know if I'm allowed to say bad words here, but I looked at her and I said, I got my effing VBAC. And we high-fived in the delivery room. I was like, yeah. We high-fived. I was like, this happened. I was like, I need the world to know.
Yes. And here you are. You're sharing it with the world. You're sharing it. And it is possible. We've seen big babies come out of vaginas. We have seen it. We really, really have.
I think that we just need the opportunity to allow our bodies to do what they need to do. I mean, he was born at 40 weeks and 4 days?
Yeah.
And he's a healthy, happy boy.
Yes. Well, you know what? In the show notes, we're going to we have a couple blogs about getting big babies out. So 5 tips to avoid a C-section delivering a large baby. We're going to post that in the show notes. So if you want to read more about big babies and how possible it actually is, check out the show notes if you don't believe this story alone, because seriously, 10 pounds, like a 10-pound baby, that's a good sized baby, right? But it's possible. And how, you're not a big person.
I'm 5'5".
Yeah, so, it's like 5'5". It's not like you're 6 feet, super, super tall. Because a lot of times, taller people, when I say big, I mean tall, torso and stuff like that. But I mean, 5'5", that's still pretty small. So, yeah,
he's 3 inches long too. So he's a long, tall boy.
He's way long. Yeah. He's going to be like his uncle.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, congratulations. I cannot believe it was seriously less than 10 days ago. But we're so happy that you shared your story with us. And I know that you're going to inspire so many out there. And, also too, there's a lot of times where providers will say, oh, you've got the big baby in there. And then the baby's not that big. Seriously, we've had clients that were told that their babies were 12 pounds and they had to have a C-section, and then they had a C-section and their baby was 7 pounds.
That's why I feel like I'm here though on this VBAC link, because I was told that with my first,
Yep.
And had
exactly.
I not her to come, I wouldn't
and it was
my story.
Right. And your baby was 8 pounds. It's just, it's so hard. And you got to follow your intuition, and good for you for sticking with it and, fighting through everybody, even when there was some tension, right? You were fighting through. So congratulations. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Megan. It really, this VBAC link just has empowered me through this whole process.
Oh, that makes my heart so happy.
Mine too. My husband too. He was so on board with everything. I can't ask for a more supportive partner.
That, we're going to drop that one too, talking about supportive provider, or not provider, partner, is how to get your partner on board. Because that truly makes a big difference when you have that support, especially if there's not a ton of support coming from the provider, or they're not as gung-ho. If you can have that support from your partner, oh my gosh, makes a world of difference.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thanks for everything you do and all of our voices that are heard.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Would you like to be a guest on the podcast? Tell us about your experience at thevbaclink.com/share. For more information on all things VBAC, including online and in-person VBAC classes, the VBAC blog, and Julie and Megan's bios, head over to thevbaclink.com. Congratulations on starting your journey of learning and discovery with the VBAC Link.
Do you sleep too well? Do you find yourself unafraid to go in your creepy basement? Are you too comfortable in the dark? Then come to Haunted Worlds of Fun and get the fear scared back into you. On select nights, September 16th through October 29th, we'll frighten you so bad, you'll never turn the lights off again. Side effects may include sore throat from screaming, elevated heart rate, fear, hiccups, anxiety, hives, sweaty palms, and raised neck hair.
Tickets as low as $29.99 for a very limited time, only at worldsoffun.com.
Heard my little sis is buying a car. You'll need my secret guide.
Gross, no way. I already used Capital One Auto Navigator.
I bet your credit score
Wasn't impacted at all, so ha. I got my real rate and monthly payment, had an amazing test drive at the dealership, and made the purchase.
Taking the easy way out. That's so you.
Still not getting it. That's so you. Capital One, what's in your wallet?
Terms and conditions apply. Find out more at CapitalOne.com/autonavigator.